The TBFs did succeed in launching at Akagi, but violent maneuvering saved the Japanese carrier. Savaged by the Zeros and by furious anti-aircraft fire, only one TBF and two B-26s survived the raid. At almost the same time as the Japanese fleet was beating off the first wave of attackers from Midway, the American task forces were preparing to launch their own strike waves. Reconnaissance had now confirmed that there were not one but two enemy carriers in the area. Such a target was simply too good a chance to miss. The latest reconnaissance placed the two Japanese carriers over 200 miles from the Americans. The maximum range for an airstrike was around 150 miles, so the first priority was to close the gap. Assuming that Nagumo's carriers would still be steaming towards Midway, Fletcher set a course to intercept. Only Spruance's Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet was to be sent. Task Force 17 with Yorktown would wait to recover her scout planes and follow later. If the Americans were to catch the Japanese as they rearmed aircraft returning from the attack on Midway, they would have to launch their first strike wave around 0700 hours. Although the range was closing quickly, it was still too great for the Devastator torpedo bombers to strike and return home. They would be sent regardless. Those that survived the raid would have to ditch in the sea. Altogether, Hornet and Enterprise launched 29 Devastator torpedo bombers and 72 Dauntless dive bombers. For fighter cover, there were 20 Wildcats. Admiral Spruance was aware that only 2 of at least 4 Japanese carriers had been located, and kept 36 fighters to defend his task force from any Japanese counterattack. As the strike groups from Hornet and Enterprise set course for the enemy fleet, Yorktown, her scout planes now recovered, raced to catch up with Task Force 16. At 08:38, Admiral Fletcher launched his strike aircraft. Within half an hour, the total number of American aircraft heading for the Japanese fleet had reached 156. Even now, the Japanese were still unaware that they had been found and targeted by enemy carriers. Nagumo's men were toiling to prepare their aircraft for the second raid on Midway, and the Admiral was confident his fleet was secure. His scout planes had been out almost 2 hours and had reported no sign of an American task force. In fact, Japanese reconnaissance had been a disastrous failure. By now, Task Force 16, steaming towards Nagumo's fleet, was well inside the search area of the Japanese scout planes. However, Chikuma's float plane had flown right past the Americans and had failed to spot them. Because Tone's scout could not search the same area until the return leg of its flight, and had been delayed by half an hour to begin with, the error was not detected for a considerable time. When it was, at 07:25, the pilot's report mentioned only enemy surface ships. As a result, Nagumo now believed there was no immediate threat from American carriers. At 07:48, as the Japanese were just about to launch the second Midway strike, they themselves suddenly came under attack. It was another raid from Midway Island. First came 16 Dauntless dive bombers, whose inexperienced pilots approached in a shallow glide. The Zeros of Nagumo's combat air patrol destroyed half their number before they even reached the carriers. Next came Midway's B-17s, dropping their bombs from 20,000 feet. Not a single Japanese vessel was hit. Midway's marine vindicators were equally unsuccessful. As the American raiders headed home, and Nagumo once more turned into the wind to launch his second wave against Midway, dramatic news was reported by a scout plane. The pilot had spotted a carrier. For Nagumo, the revelation could not have come at a worse moment. While the Japanese second wave was preparing to launch, Nagumo's first wave, just returned from Midway, was circling, waiting to land. Also waiting to refuel and rearm were the fleet's Zero fighters, which had been in action protecting the carriers. If Nagumo were to launch his second wave against the reported enemy carrier, they would have to go without fighter cover. Nagumo decided to wait. He would return his second wave below decks, recover his circling aircraft for refueling, then launch a full-scale attack on the American fleet. At 09:17, with all their aircraft recovered, the Japanese carriers, up to now heading towards Midway, turned east-northeast to close with the American force. Nagumo's strike would be ready to launch at 10:30 hours. As the Japanese surged ahead at 30 knots, the decks of Nagumo's carriers were chaotic. Flight crew struggled frantically to refuel and rearm their aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes lay everywhere, and there was no time to follow safety procedures. And unknown to the Japanese, who had no radar, the first American torpedo bombers were only 3 minutes away. The American Air Group from Task Force 16 had followed a course based on the assumption that the Japanese fleet had carried on sailing towards Midway. Instead, Nagumo had changed course. As a result, most of the dive bombers and fighters from Hornet, 45 aircraft in all, failed to find the enemy. A second group of Hornet's aircraft had also, at first, missed Nagumo's fleet, but had then turned north and within minutes had found the Japanese carriers. The first target for Hornet's torpedo bombers was Akagi. As the squadron swept in at low level, the Zeros pounced. The few Americans that survived were torn apart by the fleet's anti-aircraft fire. Not one torpedo bomber and only one pilot survived. Within minutes of the first raid, torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown began their attack. Once again, the American pilots were slaughtered, and no enemy ships were hit. Only 6 raiders survived. With the torpedo attacks beaten off and his fleet still unscathed, Nagumo was at last ready to send his waiting strike aircraft against the American carriers. Just as the launch signal was about to be given, American dive bombers, which had been lurking high in the clouds, pounced on the carriers. The first victim was Kaga. The time was 10:20 hours. The first bomb to strike Kaga landed on the rear of her flight deck, squarely amongst aircraft, armed and waiting to take off. 2 more hit near her forward elevator. Another exploded in the hangar below, igniting fuel and detonating bombs. Kaga was left a raging inferno within minutes, and almost everyone on her bridge was killed. As Kaga burned, Akagi was launching its first Zero fighter for the attack that was supposed to smash the American fleet. At that moment, 3 dauntless dive bombers struck. The first hit on Akagi landed near her midships lift and exploded in the hangar. The next fell amongst the parked aircraft on her deck. Fuel and bombs ignited immediately, killing the elite of the Japanese air fleet in their cockpits. Within minutes, the fire had spread forward, and Admiral Nagumo's flagship was doomed. The next victim of the American dive bombers was Soryu. Just after 10:25, 3 bombs smashed into the carrier's flight deck. The first bomb fell between Soryu's second and third lifts. The next landed in front of the forward lift and penetrated to the hangar, detonating bombs, torpedoes, and fuel. The third struck on the rear deck, completely destroying her waiting strike wave. In the space of 5 minutes, the mightiest carrier fleet in existence had been shattered. Admiral Nagumo, his flagship blazing, was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser. Of his once magnificent carrier force, only Hiryu was left, and immediately the order was given to launch her strike aircraft. There was still some hope that even now, a devastating blow could be visited on the American enemy. The first wave of Hiryu's strike force was made up of 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters. Their target was Task Force 17 and the carrier Yorktown. Shortly before noon, the Vals were detected by Yorktown's radar. Already, 12 Wildcat fighters were in the air covering the carrier, and another 15 were on deck refueling.